It was a busy Monday morning at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The terminal buzzed with travelers rushing to catch their flights, and among them was Sarah Henderson, a 45-year-old marketing executive known for her designer suits and perpetual stern expression. Sarah walked briskly through the airport, her heels clicking against the floor as she pulled her expensive leather carry-on. She had specifically chosen first-class tickets for her flight to Los Angeles, believing it would guarantee her the comfort and exclusivity she felt she deserved. Her perfectly styled blonde hair and crisp navy suit reflected her attention to maintaining a certain image. As she approached Gate B-15, Sarah checked her boarding pass for the 100th time. She had spent extra money to be one of the first passengers to board the plane. The gate agent called for first-class passengers, and Sarah stepped forward with a satisfied smile, presenting her ticket. "Good morning, Miss Henderson. Have a pleasant flight," the gate agent said cheerfully. Sarah merely nodded in response, too focused on getting to her seat to bother with pleasantries. Walking down the jet bridge, Sarah mentally prepared herself for the 5-hour flight ahead. She had important meetings in Los Angeles and needed to review her presentations. The flight attendant greeted her warmly at the plane's entrance, directing her to her seat in 2B. As Sarah approached her assigned row, she stopped abruptly. In seat 2A, next to the window, sat a well-dressed black man in his mid-30s. He was absorbed in reading what appeared to be a medical journal, his wire-rimmed glasses perched professionally on his nose. A dark blue suit jacket hung neatly on the hook beside him. The man looked up and smiled politely. "Good morning," he said in a warm, educated voice. Sarah's lips tightened into a thin line as she noticed his ID badge clipped to his shirt pocket. Dr. Marcus Williams, Chief of Cardiology. Sarah's face flushed red as she turned sharply to face the flight attendant who was helping another passenger store their luggage. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp and demanding. "I need to speak with you immediately." The flight attendant, Lisa Chen, approached with a professional smile. "How can I help you, ma'am?" Sarah lowered her voice to a harsh whisper, though still loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I need to change my seat. This won't work for me." Her eyes darted meaningfully toward Dr. Williams, who continued reading his journal, though his shoulders had tensed slightly. "I'm sorry, Ms. Henderson, but this flight is completely full today," Lisa explained calmly. "Is there a specific issue with your seat?" Sarah's voice rose. "Yes, there is an issue. I paid good money for this ticket, and I expect certain standards." She glanced again at Dr. Williams, making her meaning clear through her tone and expression. Several nearby passengers began to stare, some shaking their heads in disapproval. Dr. Williams remained focused on his journal, his years of dealing with prejudice evident in his practiced composure. "Ma'am," Lisa said firmly, "all our passengers have paid for their tickets, and Dr. Williams is a valued frequent flyer with our airline. I cannot change your seat, but if you're uncomfortable with your first-class assignment, we can try to accommodate you in economy, though it would be a middle seat." Sarah's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "This is unacceptable. I want to speak to your supervisor immediately." As Sarah created a scene, more passengers tried to move past her to reach their seats, causing a backup in the aisle. Dr. Williams finally looked up, his expression calm and dignified. "Please, ma'am, you're welcome to have the aisle seat. I'm quite comfortable by the window." His professional demeanor and kind response only seemed to agitate Sarah further. "I don't need your help," she snapped. "I need a different seat entirely." The situation was drawing more attention now. An elderly gentleman a few rows ahead turned to watch the commotion, his eyes narrowing at Sarah's behavior. Other passengers began to whisper among themselves, some taking out their phones to record the incident. Lisa maintained her professional composure. "Ms. Henderson, I need to ask you to take your seat now, or I'll have to contact the captain. We're delaying our departure time." Sarah stood rigid in the aisle, her face a mixture of anger and embarrassment as she realized she was quickly becoming the subject of numerous phone cameras. With no other choice, she roughly stored her carry-on in the overhead compartment and sat down in 2B, making sure to lean as far away from Dr. Williams as possible. Little did Sarah know, her display of prejudice was about to come back to haunt her in ways she never could have imagined. As the plane began taxiing down the runway, the tension in first class remained thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah sat stiffly in her seat, purposely angling her body toward the aisle and away from Dr. Williams. She aggressively tapped on her tablet, pretending to work while occasionally shooting sideways glances at her seatmate. The flight attendant, Lisa, passed through the cabin for final checks. When she reached Sarah's row, she noticed the woman had still not fastened her seatbelt. "Ma'am, please buckle your seatbelt. We're about to take off." Sarah clicked her seatbelt with unnecessary force, muttering under her breath about the service. A few passengers nearby exchanged knowing looks, still disturbed by her earlier behavior. Dr. Williams maintained his professional demeanor, calmly reviewing patient files on his laptop. His colleagues at Chicago Memorial Hospital had sent him several challenging cases to review during his flight to a medical conference in Los Angeles. Despite Sarah's obvious discomfort, he remained focused on his work. Once they reached cruising altitude, Lisa began the drink service. When she reached their row, Dr. Williams politely requested water. Before Lisa could even turn to Sarah, the marketing executive spoke sharply. "I'll have a white wine," Sarah demanded. "And I'd prefer if you could serve me first next time. I paid full price for this seat, unlike some people who probably used frequent flyer miles." Her pointed comment hung in the air. Lisa's professional smile tightened. "Dr. Williams is one of our highest-tier frequent flyers, Ms. Henderson. He flies with us weekly to perform life-saving surgeries across the country." Sarah's face reddened again, but before she could respond, a commotion started several rows ahead. An elderly man was coughing violently, his face turning an alarming shade of red. "Is everything okay up there?" Lisa called out, already moving toward the disturbance. The elderly man's wife was patting his back frantically. "Gerald? Gerald, what's wrong?" Her voice trembled with fear as her husband continued to cough and gasp for air. The color drained from Sarah's face as she heard the name. She peered around the seat in front of her, finally getting a clear view of the struggling passenger. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Uncle Gerald." Indeed, it was Gerald Henderson, Sarah's beloved uncle who had practically raised her after her parents' divorce. He was traveling to Los Angeles to attend the same family reunion as Sarah, though they had booked separate flights. Lisa's voice came over the intercom. "If there are any medical professionals on board, please press your call button immediately." Without hesitation, Dr. Williams pressed his button and stood up. As he moved to step past Sarah, she instinctively tried to block his path. "What do you think you're doing?" Dr. Williams looked at her calmly but firmly. "Ma'am, I'm a cardiac surgeon. Your uncle appears to be in serious distress. Please let me help him." Sarah froze, caught between her prejudices and her concern for her uncle. After a moment's hesitation, she moved her legs aside, allowing Dr. Williams to pass. The other passengers watched as Dr. Williams quickly made his way to Gerald's side. He knelt beside the elderly man's seat, his movements precise and professional as he began to assess the situation. "Sir, I'm Dr. Williams, Chief of Cardiology at Chicago Memorial. Can you tell me what you're feeling right now?" His voice was calm and authoritative. Gerald tried to speak between coughs, pointing to his chest. His wife, Margaret, spoke up frantically. "He has a heart condition. He took his medication this morning." "But what type of medication?" Dr. Williams asked, already checking Gerald's pulse and breathing. Sarah watched from her seat, her hands gripping the armrests tightly. The same doctor she had refused to sit next to was now the only person who might be able to help her uncle. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on the surrounding passengers, who glanced between Sarah and the unfolding scene with meaningful looks. As Dr. Williams continued to work with focused determination, Sarah's earlier behavior began to weigh heavily on her conscience. But this was only the beginning of a lesson in humility that would unfold over the next few hours of the flight. The tension in the airplane cabin grew as Dr. Williams quickly assessed Gerald's condition. The elderly man's breathing was becoming more labored, and his face had taken on a concerning bluish tint. Sarah remained frozen in her seat, watching helplessly as the doctor she had discriminated against worked to save her uncle's life. "Lisa, I need the emergency medical kit immediately," Dr. Williams called out, his voice steady but urgent. "And please ask the pilot to contact ground medical control. We may need to make an emergency landing." The flight attendant rushed to retrieve the kit while another crew member made the call to the cockpit. Passengers craned their necks to watch the scene, many of them recording with their phones. Mr. Henderson, Dr. Williams said clearly, maintaining eye contact with Gerald, I believe you're having a cardiac event. I'm going to help you, but I need you to try to stay calm and follow my instructions. Can you do that for me? Gerald managed a weak nod, his hand clutching his chest. His wife Margaret held his other hand, tears streaming down her face. Please save him, doctor, she pleaded. Sarah finally found the strength to move. She unbuckled her seatbelt and hurried to her uncle's row, her previous prejudices forgotten in the face of family emergency. Uncle Gerald, I'm here, she said, her voice shaking. Dr. Williams glanced up briefly, his expression professional despite everything that had happened earlier. Ms. Henderson, please stay back and give us some space. I need to work quickly. Lisa returned with the medical kit, which Dr. Williams opened with practiced efficiency. He pulled out a blood pressure cuff and stethoscope, quickly taking Gerald's vitals. The numbers clearly concerned him, though he maintained a calm demeanor. His blood pressure is dangerously high, and I'm detecting significant arrhythmia, Dr. Williams announced to Lisa. We need to stabilize him. You have aspirin in this kit. While Lisa searched the kit, Dr. Williams loosened Gerald's collar and helped him into a more comfortable position. Mr. Henderson, have you experienced anything like this before? Margaret answered for her husband. He had a mild heart attack 2 years ago. He's been on medication since then. Sarah stood nearby, wringing her hands. The shame of her earlier behavior crashed over her in waves as she watched Dr. Williams work with such skill and compassion. Other passengers who had witnessed her racist display now looked at her with a mixture of judgment and pity. Dr. Williams administered the aspirin and continued monitoring Gerald's vitals. After several tense minutes, the elderly man's color began to improve, and his breathing became less labored. The doctor maintained constant communication with both Gerald and the flight crew, who were coordinating with medical professionals on the ground. The good news is that we've caught this early, Dr. Williams explained to Gerald and his family. The medication is helping, but you'll need proper medical attention as soon as we land. I've recommended that we continue to our destination rather than make an emergency landing, as you're now stable, but I'll stay here to monitor you for the remainder of the flight. Sarah couldn't hold back any longer. Dr. Williams, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say, after how I treated you. Dr. Williams cut her off gently but firmly. Ms. Henderson, now isn't the time. Your uncle needs calm and quiet. We can discuss other matters later. The rebuke, though professional, made Sarah shrink back. She watched as Dr. Williams pulled a small notebook from his pocket and began documenting Gerald's vital signs and symptoms for the medical team that would meet them in Los Angeles. Other passengers had begun whispering among themselves, some pointing out how the same woman who had refused to sit next to the black doctor was now watching him save her uncle's life. Sarah could hear their comments, each one striking her like a physical blow. Lisa approached with a bottle of water for Gerald and extra pillows to make him comfortable. She worked alongside Dr. Williams with practiced efficiency, their temporary medical station taking up the front section of the cabin. As the situation stabilized, Sarah returned to her seat, her mind racing. The universe had dealt her a powerful lesson in the most unexpected way, and as she watched Dr. Williams continuing to care for her uncle with unwavering professionalism, she realized this was only the beginning of her journey toward confronting her own prejudices. An hour into the flight, Dr. Williams had transformed the front section of first class into a makeshift medical station. He sat on a spare seat next to Gerald, regularly checking his vital signs and keeping detailed notes. The other passengers had settled into an uneasy quiet, occasionally glancing toward the ongoing medical situation. Sarah watched from her seat, her perfect corporate image now disheveled from stress. Her makeup had smudged from wiping away tears, and her designer suit was wrinkled from nervous fidgeting. The gravity of her earlier behavior weighed heavily on her conscience. Blood pressure is continuing to stabilize, Dr. Williams announced quietly to Lisa, who had been assisting him throughout the crisis. But we'll need a wheelchair ready when we land. He shouldn't walk to the terminal. Margaret, still holding her husband's hand, looked at Dr. Williams with grateful eyes. We can't thank you enough, Doctor. If you hadn't been on this flight. Her voice trailed off, unable to finish the frightening thought. Gerald, now more alert and comfortable, managed a weak smile. You're a godsend, Dr. Williams. I don't know how we can ever repay you. Sarah listened to this exchange, each word of gratitude from her relatives feeling like a personal rebuke. She remembered her uncle's teachings when she was young, about treating everyone with respect and dignity. How far she had strayed from those lessons, letting prejudice cloud her judgment. A light turbulence shook the plane, causing Gerald to grip his armrest nervously. Dr. Williams immediately noticed his patient's anxiety and leaned in to reassure him. Try to stay calm, Mr. Henderson. A slightly elevated heart rate is normal during turbulence, but we want to keep you as relaxed as possible. The care and attention Dr. Williams showed made Sarah's earlier accusations seem even more ridiculous. Here was a man who had dedicated his life to saving others, regardless of their race, beliefs, or how they treated him. Lisa approached with fresh water for Gerald and Dr. Williams. As she passed Sarah's row, she paused briefly. Miss Henderson, would you like some water as well? Sarah nodded meekly, accepting the water with a quiet thank you. She noticed how the flight attendant's previously cold professional demeanor toward her had softened slightly, perhaps seeing her genuine distress over her uncle's condition. The other passengers had begun sharing the story throughout the plane via whispered conversations. Can you believe she didn't want to sit next to him because he was black? And now he's saving her uncle's life. Talk about karma. These whispers reached Sarah's ears, each one a stark reminder of her prejudice. She watched as Dr. Williams checked her uncle's pulse again, his movements precise and confident. His medical credentials, which she had dismissed earlier, were now clearly evident in every action he took. Margaret turned in her seat to look at Sarah. Honey, isn't it miraculous that such a skilled doctor was on our flight? God works in mysterious ways. Sarah could only nod, fighting back fresh tears. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. Her aunt's words about God's mysterious ways felt particularly poignant. Was this divine intervention, teaching her a powerful lesson about judgment and prejudice? Dr. Williams maintained his professional focus, seemingly unbothered by the drama surrounding the situation. He reviewed Gerald's medication list with Margaret, asking detailed questions about his medical history and regular doctors in Los Angeles. I'll write up my observations for the emergency team meeting us at the gate, he explained. They'll want to do a full cardiac workup at the hospital, but I believe we've managed to prevent a major cardiac event. Sarah finally gathered the courage to approach her uncle's row again. This time she stood quietly, waiting for Dr. Williams to acknowledge her presence. When he looked up, she spoke softly. Dr. Williams, would it be all right if I sat with my uncle for a few minutes? The doctor nodded professionally. Of course. Just try not to excite him. He needs to stay calm and relaxed. As Sarah took a seat near her uncle, she couldn't help but notice how Dr. Williams's professional demeanor never wavered, despite her earlier treatment of him. His dedication to his patient's care transcended any personal feelings he might have had about her behavior. This realization made her feel even smaller, but it also sparked something else, a desire to learn from this experience and become a better person. As the flight continued over the Midwest, Sarah sat quietly beside her Uncle Gerald, watching Dr. Williams work with unwavering dedication. The doctor had been monitoring Gerald's condition for over 2 hours now, barely taking the moment to rest. Your color is much better now, Mr. Henderson, Dr. Williams said, checking Gerald's pulse for the 100th time. But I'm still concerned about your heart rhythm. Try to avoid any sudden movements. Lisa approached with a fresh cup of coffee for Dr. Williams. Doctor, you haven't taken a break since this started. Please, at least have something to drink. The doctor accepted the coffee with a grateful nod, though his eyes never left his patient. Sarah noticed his handwritten notes had filled several pages, documenting every small change in her uncle's condition. The level of detail and care he took was remarkable. Sarah, Gerald said weakly, reaching for his niece's hand. I remember when you were just a little girl, always following me around in my garden. Remember how I taught you that every flower was beautiful in its own way? Sarah's eyes welled up with tears. She remembered those lessons well. Her uncle had always tried to teach her about acceptance and appreciating diversity. Somewhere along the way, she had lost sight of those valuable teachings. Dr. Williams pretended not to hear this personal exchange, maintaining his professional distance while still monitoring Gerald closely. But Sarah could see that he was listening, his expression thoughtful as he made another note in his journal. A slight shake of turbulence caused Gerald to tense up. Dr. Williams immediately leaned forward, placing a reassuring hand on his patient's shoulder. Deep breaths, Mr. Henderson. Remember what we discussed. Slow and steady breathing helps keep your heart rate stable. Margaret dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Dr. Williams, I don't know what we would have done without you. When Gerald collapsed at our daughter's wedding last year, it took the paramedics 20 minutes to arrive. Having you here immediately, it's a blessing. Sarah's head snapped up. Wedding? I didn't know about any collapse last year. Gerald looked sheepish. We didn't want to worry you, dear. You were so busy with your promotion at work. The realization hit Sarah hard. She had become so focused on her career, on maintaining a certain image, that she had disconnected from her family, from the values she was raised with. Her uncle had faced a health crisis, and she hadn't even known about it. Dr. Williams spoke up, his voice professional but kind. Family support is crucial for cardiac patients, Ms. Henderson. Studies show that strong family connections can significantly improve recovery outcomes. The subtle message in his words wasn't lost on Sarah. Here was the man she had discriminated against, not only saving her uncle's life, but also trying to help her reconnect with her family values. Lisa returned with another update from the cockpit. We're about 2 hours from Los Angeles. The emergency medical team has been briefed and will be waiting at the gate. Dr. Williams nodded, reviewing his notes. Good. Mr. Henderson is stable, but I want him transferred to the hospital immediately upon landing. His cardiac enzymes need to be checked, and he'll require a full workup. Sarah watched as the doctor wrote down more instructions for the emergency team. His handwriting was neat and precise, just like everything else about him. She thought about how quickly she had judged him based on nothing but his skin color, missing all the qualities that actually defined him as a person. Other passengers were still watching the scene unfold, but their whispers had changed from condemning Sarah's earlier behavior to admiring Dr. Williams's dedication. Some were even taking photos, presumably to share this story of karma and redemption on social media later. Gerald squeezed Sarah's hand. Sometimes life has a way of teaching us the lessons we need to learn, sweetheart. Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She glanced at Dr. Williams, who continued his work with quiet dignity. The shame of her earlier behavior was still fresh, but something else was growing alongside it. A determination to learn from this experience and become the person her uncle had always tried to teach her to be. As the plane began its gradual descent into Los Angeles, Dr. Williams started preparing Gerald for landing. He adjusted the elderly man's seat to a more upright position and double-checked his vital signs one final time. Your blood pressure has remained stable for the past hour, Mr. Henderson, Dr. Williams explained, writing down the latest readings. But the landing might cause some discomfort. If you feel any chest pain or shortness of breath, tell me immediately. Sarah, still seated nearby, watched the doctor's methodical preparations. Her eyes drifted to his credentials badge, now slightly wrinkled from the hours of emergency care. Chief of Cardiology at Chicago Memorial, the very hospital where her mother had received treatment years ago. Dr. Williams, she said softly, a sudden realization hitting her. Were you at Chicago Memorial 5 years ago, in the cardiac wing? The doctor paused his work briefly. Yes, I was. I had just become department head. Sarah's voice trembled. My mother was there for heart surgery that year. Her surgeon mentioned consulting with a brilliant young chief of cardiology about her case. That was you, wasn't it? Dr. Williams studied her face for a moment before recognition flickered in his eyes. Eleanor Henderson, complex valve replacement. I remember the case. He turned back to his notes, adding quietly, she had a strong spirit. Reminded me of my own mother. The irony of the situation struck Sarah like a physical blow. This man had not only helped save her mother's life 5 years ago, but was now doing the same for her uncle. And she had treated him with such contempt. Lisa approached with landing preparation instructions from the captain. We'll be touching down in 20 minutes. The medical team is standing by at gate 47. Gerald reached for his wife's hand. Margaret, dear, did you call Susan? She was supposed to pick us up from the airport. I'll handle everything, Uncle Gerald, Sarah interjected quickly. Susan doesn't need to worry about airport pickup now. I'll make sure you get to the hospital and handle all the arrangements. Dr. Williams looked up from his notes. That's good thinking, Ms. Henderson. Your uncle will need family support during his hospital stay. His tone remained professionally neutral, but there was a hint of approval in his eyes. The plane began its final descent, causing Gerald to grip his armrests tightly. Dr. Williams immediately noticed his patient's anxiety. "Focus on my voice, Mr. Henderson," he said calmly. "Remember our breathing exercises. In through the nose, out through the mouth. That's right, nice and steady." Sarah watched in amazement as her uncle relaxed under the doctor's guidance. She remembered how Gerald had used similar breathing techniques to calm her fears during thunderstorms when she was a child. Now, here was Dr. Williams, a man she had judged so harshly, showing the same kind of care and patience. As the plane descended through the clouds, sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the cabin. Dr. Williams's face was bathed in the golden light as he continued monitoring Gerald, his expression serene despite having spent hours providing emergency care. Other passengers had begun preparing for landing, but many still glanced toward their row, witnessing the ongoing care and attention Dr. Williams provided. Several had their phones out, documenting what had become a powerful story of prejudice, redemption, and professional dedication. "Doctor," Gerald said suddenly, "I know you're probably missing important meetings in Los Angeles because of me." Dr. Williams shook his head. "My medical conference doesn't start until tomorrow. Besides, patient care always comes first. That's something we learn early in our careers." Sarah felt tears welling up again. The contrast between her earlier behavior and Dr. Williams's unwavering professionalism was overwhelming. Here was a man who had every right to be angry with her, yet he had shown nothing but compassion and dedication. As the plane's wheels touched down on the runway, Sarah made a silent promise to herself. This experience wouldn't be just another embarrassing incident to forget. It would be a turning point. The journey ahead would involve more than just getting her uncle to the hospital. It would be about reconsidering her own prejudices and the person she had become. The plane taxied toward the gate, where emergency medical personnel waited. But for Sarah Henderson, something far more significant than a medical emergency was coming to an end. Her old way of seeing the world. The plane came to a complete stop at Gate 47, where emergency medical personnel were already waiting with a stretcher. Dr. Williams efficiently organized the transfer of his patient, giving clear, precise instructions to the paramedics who boarded the aircraft. "Patient experienced cardiac symptoms approximately 3 hours ago," Dr. Williams reported professionally. "I've maintained regular monitoring of his vitals. Blood pressure stabilized but showed occasional fluctuations. They'll need immediate cardiac evaluation." As the other passengers remained seated, the paramedics carefully helped Gerald onto the stretcher. Margaret held her husband's hand, tears of worry and gratitude streaming down her face. Sarah stood nearby, clutching her uncle's carry-on bag, watching the medical team work with practiced efficiency. "Dr. Williams," one of the paramedics said suddenly, "I thought you were speaking at the cardiology conference tomorrow. Didn't expect to see you here." "Life has its own plans sometimes," Dr. Williams replied with a slight smile, handing over his detailed notes. "Please make sure Dr. Rodriguez at Cederson gets these. She's expecting Mr. Henderson." Sarah's eyes widened. "You've already arranged for a specialist?" Dr. Williams nodded while gathering his belongings. "I called her during the flight. Dr. Rodriguez is one of the best cardiac specialists on the West Coast. Your uncle will be in excellent hands." As the paramedics began moving Gerald toward the exit, other passengers finally started to disembark. Many stopped to shake Dr. Williams's hand or pat him on the back, commending him for his service. A few shot meaningful glances at Sarah, who stood awkwardly to the side, her earlier attitude now a source of visible shame. Lisa, the flight attendant, approached Dr. Williams with his suit jacket that had remained hung up during the emergency. "Doctor, on behalf of the airline, we can't thank you enough. We'll make sure to note your assistance in our records." "Just doing my job," Dr. Williams replied humbly. "Though I would appreciate it if someone could help me get a taxi to my hotel. I seem to have missed my scheduled pickup." "Absolutely not." Sarah spoke up suddenly, her voice firm despite her nervousness. "Please, let me drive you. It's the least I can do after everything." The cabin fell silent as passengers within earshot paused to witness this interaction. Dr. Williams studied Sarah's face for a moment, perhaps looking for sincerity in her offer. "That's not necessary, Ms. Henderson. Your uncle needs you. Mom and Susan are meeting us at the hospital. Margaret interrupted, having overheard the exchange. Sarah, you should take Dr. Williams wherever he needs to go. Without him. She didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood the implication. As they made their way through the terminal, following behind Gerald's stretcher, Sarah noticed how different Dr. Williams looked now compared to when she'd first seen him on the plane. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up from hours of patient care, yet he carried himself with the same quiet dignity. At the hospital entrance, before Gerald was wheeled inside, he reached out to grasp Dr. Williams's hand. "Thank you, doctor. You're not just a great physician, you're a great man." Some people might not see it right away, he glanced meaningfully at Sarah, but character always shows itself in the end. Sarah felt her face flush at her uncle's words, but she knew he was right. As the medical team took Gerald inside, accompanied by Margaret, Sarah turned to Dr. Williams. "My car is in the short-term parking lot," she said softly. "Unless you prefer to take a taxi, which I completely understand." Dr. Williams adjusted his glasses, considering the offer. "Ms. Henderson, I accept your offer for a ride, but not out of necessity. I accept because it seems you have something you need to say, and perhaps something you need to hear as well." His perceptiveness struck Sarah deeply. Indeed, she had much to say, many apologies to make, and even more to learn. As they walked toward the parking lot, she realized this car ride would be more than just transportation. It would be the beginning of her journey toward becoming a better person. Behind them, the setting sun cast long shadows across the hospital parking lot, a fitting backdrop to a day that had started with prejudice but was ending with the promise of redemption. The drive to Dr. Williams's hotel began in awkward silence. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she navigated through Los Angeles traffic, occasionally glancing at her passenger. Dr. Williams sat quietly, his medical bag on his lap, looking straight ahead. Finally, at a red light, Sarah found her voice. "I don't even know how to begin apologizing for my behavior on the plane." "Ms. Henderson," Dr. Williams began, his tone measured and calm. "Apologies are important, but understanding why we need to apologize is even more crucial." Sarah nodded slowly, tears forming in her eyes. "I've spent years climbing the corporate ladder, thinking I was better than others because of my success, my status. Today showed me how wrong I've been. You saw past my horrible behavior and saved my uncle's life. I'm a doctor, Ms. Henderson. We take an oath to help anyone in need, regardless of who they are or how they treat us." He paused, adjusting his glasses. "But this isn't just about today, is it?" The traffic light turned green, and Sarah drove on, her thoughts racing. "No, it's not. My Uncle Gerald, he raised me better than this. He taught me to see the beauty in everyone, to judge people by their character. Somewhere along the way, I lost those values." They pulled up to the hotel, but neither made a move to exit the car. The setting sun cast a warm glow through the windows, creating a peaceful atmosphere for this important conversation. "You know," Dr. Williams said thoughtfully, "in my years of practice, I've learned that healing isn't just about medicine. Sometimes it's about recognizing our own ailments, prejudices, biases, fears, and having the courage to treat them." Sarah wiped away a tear. "When you helped save my mother 5 years ago, I never knew. If I had known it was you." "Would it have made a difference?" Dr. Williams asked gently. "Or would it have only changed your behavior toward me specifically, leaving the underlying prejudice intact?" His words struck home. Sarah realized he was right. True change had to come from within, not from individual exceptions to one's prejudices. "I want to be better," she whispered. "I need to be better." Dr. Williams smiled for the first time since they'd met. "Recognition is the first step toward change, Ms. Henderson. Your uncle's wisdom isn't lost. It's just been buried under years of different influences. You can choose to uncover it again." He reached into his medical bag and pulled out a business card. "Your uncle will need follow-up care when he returns to Chicago. Have him make an appointment at my clinic." He handed her the card, adding, "And if he'd like to continue this conversation about personal growth, my office door is always open." Sarah accepted the card with trembling hands, reading his credentials through tears. The same credentials she had dismissed hours earlier now felt like a lifeline to becoming a better person. "Thank you, Dr. Williams. Not just for saving Uncle Gerald, but for showing me what true character looks like." As Dr. Williams stepped out of the car, he turned back one last time. "Ms. Henderson, remember this day. not as a source of shame, but as the moment you chose to change. That's what matters most. Sarah watched him enter the hotel, his dignified bearing unchanged despite the exhausting day. She sat in her car for a long moment, holding his business card and reflecting on how a flight she had dreaded had become the wake-up call she desperately needed. Later that evening, as she sat beside her sleeping uncle in the hospital room, Sarah took out her phone and deleted several social media accounts she had followed that had fed her prejudices. She pulled out the garden photos her uncle had sent her over the years, pictures she had been too busy to look at, and smiled at his messages about how every flower added its own unique beauty to the garden. Dr. Williams's card sat on the bedside table, a reminder of both her worst moment and her commitment to change. Tomorrow, she would start the hard work of becoming the person her uncle had always believed she could be. Tonight, she was simply grateful for a second chance, delivered through the profound dignity of a doctor who had every right to judge her, but chose to heal instead. Sometimes, Sarah realized, the most important healing isn't the kind that happens in hospitals, it's the kind that happens in hearts.